Boom! What is up, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Diabetes Podcast. On this podcast, both Dr. Grady and myself, both type 1 diabetics, talk about our personal experiences about being type 1, as well as a whole variety of other related topics to both type 1 and type 2 diabetes, the medical side of things, as well as everyday things that diabetics may or may not go through. This is all in the hopes that anyone listening finds value and can use some of this information to live the life that you deserve. So if you enjoy this video, we encourage you to like, share, and subscribe to this video and our YouTube channel, as well as to the podcast in general. And as always, this podcast is not meant for any kind of medical advice, and you should always consult your doctor and healthcare team before applying anything different.
Welcome back, Diabetes.
So without further ado, let's get into the fun stuff. Let's get into the video, and we'll catch you on the Diabetes
what
Podcast.
we were talking about last time, which is more geared towards diet in relationship to insulin resistance in many of the different tissue cells. And we're going to talk about many different diets in this episode and get into the context of those diets and how it relates to you and maybe the research that you're looking at. So it should be a good episode. I'm pretty excited about it. And yeah.
And for those following along at home, that article, once again, is Modeling Insulin Resistance in Rodents by Alteration and Diet. What have high-fat and high-calorie diets revealed? Question mark. Yeah, and so this is the second episode, second part of all of this, and we released that first part on YouTube, which was really exciting.
Yeah.
And this one will be on YouTube as well, and so, anyone wanting to watch and listen to us that way or want to share it that way, feel free to do so, because it's a whole different world up there. As of now, we have 18 views.
Oh yeah, big time.
But that's still our goal, is just to reach as many people as we can, and just have conversations that really impact both diabetics and non-diabetics in thought-provoking ways. So like Grady said, excited to record another one and continue the conversation from last time. So So before we dive into it, the theme, or something that I think both Grady and I have walked away ourselves with this article, as well as want others to maybe walk away from this conversation, is that context matters, right? And context matters in two different ways, both in the literature that you're reading, as well as context matters in how you're trying to apply nutritional science, and meaning the individual. So context matters with the literature we'll get into it, of how, what fats do people use? What kind of samples are people using? We talked about last time the different types of rats and mice and things like that. Not just understanding the methods, but literally understanding how the literature applies to anything and everything else, and always critically asking questions, not because you want to be skeptical of it 100%, but because you're trying to really understand and see the value in it, and understand shortcomings, but as well as understand strengths of literature. So that's a big thing when doing any kind of nutrition reading in the literature, as well as the context of the human. How are we applying this? We're talking about all these different types of foods and fats and calories and carbs, but we're not talking about the gut at all. We're not talking about leaky gut. We're not talking about the microbiome. We're not talking about brain health. Yet all those things have giant impacts on your individual life. Mm-hmm. And if you're not considering how the big picture is affecting your life, and how this diet that you're applying is really changing everything, then you're missing the boat on some things. And so context matters in both those things. And so it's important to, as we go through this, to keep those things in mind. And I think that's one of the big takeaways that both Dr. Grady and myself have kind of re-highlighted as we review this article ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that being said, I remember even before we recorded our first one, Grady, you were like, Garrett, what are you trying to, say with this paper? Because it almost like defeated our biases. Both Grady and I would probably fall in a lower carb category camp if we were threw our hat in the ringer of battles between diets and keto versus vegan versus all meat, carnivore versus paleo versus whatever have you. Like we'd definitely be in a more low carb camp, but and maybe higher fat. And this kind of almost, it's really easy to read this article and say, yeah, fat's bad.
Mm-hmm.
That's thanks for you two because you're wrong. But that's not really the point. Anyways, so that being said, let's kind of dive into it. So let's start talking about the actual diets itself. Let's start with the high fat diet, Doc.
Okay.
So, you know, there's a lot of things to consider that this article brings up when talking about high fat diets. One thing that I think is really important that these researchers pointed out that the variability that you need to consider when a paper is talking about high fat diet is how much fat is in a high fat diet. It literally can range with all these articles that these people have referenced anywhere from 20 to 95% of your calories being fat that is described in the literature. So right then and there, how can you be talking about the same thing if there's a range of 20 to 95% is high fat? Right then and there is like red flags of just even using that term. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty crazy range. If 20% of your calories is coming from fat versus 90% of your calories is coming from fat, to me, those are two totally different diets, and the physiology is going to be completely different with all that. So that's that's why science is such a struggle, especially nutritional science, because there's just so many variables. And then when you add on top of that the variables of what is classified as a high fat diet, makes it even harder to realize, okay, what is actually going on here, and is this what is actually being applied to me? So if you're applying a high fat diet to yourself, and then you come across an article that says this is bad or this is good, well, you have to dig deeper into that article and say, okay, what are they using for that high fat diet, and is that comparable to what I'm doing? So yeah, it's unfortunate, but that's the world we live in.
Mm-hmm. And, I'm not sure when this term was started to be used, but now there's even a different category, a very high fat diet, which researchers use to represent closer to more of a ketogenic type research. That's something that has a little bit better of a range when you use that term of 80 to 95% of the calories from fat. But that's super hard to do. Like you would have to be a really hard keto head to be 95% of your calories from fat. You have to be like eating avocados that are drizzled in olive oil while eating lettuce that's cooked in bacon grease while drinking some, I don't know, olive juice, like olive oil in a cup.
Yeah, exactly.
I
don't know. I would like to see like an outline of what they're actually eating in that diet.
And it's easy to do like 95% fat in rat mice model type of study, and obviously it can be done too because people who do hardcore keto and get results metabolically change a lot and live healthy lives that way. So obviously it's done, but I don't think I've ever been that hardcore keto for very long to say, yeah, I successfully had 95% of my calories, especially as a type 1 diabetic, from as fat. That's maybe a little out of yours and I's reach to do something like that.
I eat way too much protein to have 95% of my calories from fat.
And this is something that I think both you and I need to, or maybe just, I can't speak for you for this, but I definitely need to read more about, because I've seen people that are advocates of carnivore diet and those types of things that say you can be ketosis. But, as type 1 diabetics, we're like the perfect, experiment to understand some of these things. And we know when you eat too much protein, it raises your blood sugar. So how can you stay in ketosis if you have enough meat? That being said, I've heard, like, I think it was on the Peter Tia podcast, if you're a really well-trained athlete on the ketogenic diet, I heard that this guy say you could have like 300 grams of carbs and still be in ketosis. That just blows my mind. Like, I'm not nearly an expert of that kind of stuff. But I know that protein raises glucose, and it definitely can, depending on how many carbs you eat or don't eat. So,
Yep. Yeah, and that's why, again, it comes back to context and um, what your physiology is, and that can
mhm,
change day to day, week to week, because of activity levels, because of stress levels,
mhm.
because of digestion and how that's working. So to put a blanket across it and say this is what happens, you can be in ketosis with carnivore or you can't be in ketosis with carnivore, isn't a responsible narrative, because each person is going to be different. I know for the most part, even though I have a lot of protein throughout the day, I still can be in ketosis with that. And I think it also depends on greatly on the timing of that protein. If you have all of your protein all at once in a big meal, that's
Mhm.
going to be way different if you have that same amount of protein spread out over the whole day, because you're going to be digesting that much more efficiently, much more thoroughly, and it's not going to be all hitting your system all at once, so your body doesn't have to convert that excess protein into sugar. It can still utilize that protein because it's not hitting it all at once.
Right. Like even last time, I mean, you can take exactly what you just said and apply it what we talked about last time. Of if you're eating high fat and high carb simultaneously, and it's going within the muscle cell, it wants to take the high carb and turn into fat,
Mm-hmm.
because you don't need that many carbs. So why would you break down the fat you're eating to energy if you're already taking carbs and using energy to turn it into fat? Same thing like you just said. If you're eating too much protein, you're not going to be using it the same way, and that's going to need to be turned to glucose. And so therefore you're wasting that, and it further dampens that metabolic effect that you're even trying to get in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So that being said, I wanted to read this quote from this part about the high fat diet, is that because the source of fat, this comes from the article, because of the source of fat used in high fat diets can vary, it is important to keep in mind that feeding rodents diverse fatty acid species have been demonstrated to lead to different metabolic outcomes. And this is outlined in the table that I read. And so then it starts to talk about how saturated fats lead to a greatly different insulin resistance. These guys summarize that saturated fats lead to more insulin resistance than higher monosaturated fat diets, and that versus PUFAs or polyunsaturated fat lead to higher insulin resistance overall in the studies. So that last part aside, the bigger takeaway is that different fatty acid species lead to different metabolic effects.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're only looking at insulin resistance from that hyperinsulinemic, I can't even say it, like the clamp.
Yeah, the euglycemic clamp.
Thank you.
Yeah.
When you're only looking at that way, that's one context of looking at insulin resistance, right? So that kind of addresses a little bit of the second part. But the fats that we eat, what kind of fat, drastically changes everything when
Mm-hmm.
we are discussing fat to begin with.
Yeah, and we discussed that pretty thoroughly in the last one, where we're talking about different fats and how some of them are more inflammatory than others, and we've talked about inflammation a lot in our previous podcasts, where inflammation can affect insulin resistance. So simply by adding fats that are more inflammatory and causing inflammation throughout the body, you can impact your insulin sensitivity. So again, the context of what fats are you putting into your body is really important with this.
Mm-hmm. And just kind of almost recap that things that the more unsaturated it is, the more polyunsaturated, the your vegetable oils, how you cook them, how rancid these fats can get, how fast, that all can be more inflammatory and therefore change things then too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly like you're saying. I think this was an interesting point that these researchers made, is that in mice, diet levels of muscle triglyceride and diacylglycerides um, tend to be higher in saturated fatty acids and monounsaturated fatty acids. However, this does not necessarily translate to different insulin sensitivity. And we talked about that kind of in the last episode, how, these triglycerides and diglycerides can be markers of insulin sensitivity, but not markers of insulin sensitivity by themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep. And just to remind people, when we talked about the athletic or the athlete paradox, where they find a lot of fat in the muscle cells, however, they are still insulin sensitive. And so, like I said, it's context, and it's not always the full picture.
I wish they talked more about this in this review, in this summary, that literally the next sentence after this discussion was, interesting enough, when you supplement a high-fat diet with omega-3 oils, improve insulin sensitivity and muscle insulin action is observed, possibly through, different mechanisms that don't need to be really said right now. But like we need to almost talk about more about omega-3s and omega-6s, but that right there changes everything too. What are the fats that give you more omega-3s versus omega-6s? That's a huge conversation that you can't just even forget about to have.
Yeah. And it comes back to that inflammatory aspect and just the quality of fats. And I thought that was kind of funny too, where they just kind of slid that in there right at the end and then didn't really expand on that much. Because to me, that's really important if you're talking about fats, because there are a lot of fats that are not very good, that are destructive in the body, cause a lot of inflammation or a lot of dysfunction in the physiology. And so to ignore the fact that omega-3s on top of a high-fat diet change the insulin resistance and change the insulin sensitivity. So I think that should be looked at maybe a little bit more thoroughly, either via this meta-analysis or review, or just simply, I don't know how much it's been studied specifically yet.
And maybe that'll be the next article that, or that type of article that we'll talk about, is omega-3s and 6s and insulin sensitivity specifically. Because I feel like even when I was tutoring and teaching biochemistry to other, chiropractic students, it became very clear to even people in that level of education that even just basic understanding of fats, of omega-3s and 6s, how those are and what those are so confused. People don't understand that. I wish there was almost more education, general education, on those types of things. And so, almost to be clear, that omega-3s and 6s are unsaturated. They are polyunsaturated fats, and that's what those omegas mean. So you can't get omega-3s and 6s from saturated fats, which are mostly saturated fat is mostly animal fats, and so great sources of omega-3s and 6s can be fish oil, but as well as some certain seeds like flax seeds. But we're not even going to get into the type of conversation of how those can differ. But just I wanted the base understanding right now that omega-3s and 6s are polyunsaturated, and they're essential fatty acids. We need them, so we do need polyunsaturated fats. But it's different than saturated fats, and we can't just get that only from beef and chicken and turkey. We need other sources to get those too.
Yeah, and like you said, that the whole concept of omega-3s and omega-6s is very complex, because they don't start necessarily as those omega-3s and omega-6s when you ingest those polyunsaturated fatty acids. Those fatty acids come into the body, and then they are typically then converted into different fats, and it goes down this chain of a pathway to get to where it needs to go. And so depending on what type of fat that you're starting with, it can go sometimes either down to an omega-3 or over into an omega-6. So it is a very complicated situation that it is really hard to understand, not only for graduate students, but definitely for the general public too.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, but they just kind of slid that in there, almost like a lawyer, like, oh, this is part of a contract. Like, don't read this part because you're probably
Yeah.
just going to skip to the conclusion anyways.
Yeah.
But here it is. So yeah, I agree. It was kind of funny that they just had that in there and didn't expand on it more. But I did want to read this phrase. So additionally, a high-fat diet consisting predominantly of medium-chain saturated fatty acids. So again, saturated fats can be more thought of animal meats. They have full hydrogen. They don't have any double bonds. So medium chain meaning length. So saturated fats can have different short, medium, long chains. So again, predominantly high-fat diets with medium-chain saturated fatty acids, such as lauric acid and capric acid, the predominantly fat acid species in coconut oil, do not seem to reduce insulin sensitivity as much as a high-fat diet containing animal-derived long-chain saturated fatty acids. And that statement alone has 5 different references, 5 different references in making a statement like that. And so again, what fats are you eating? Where is it from? I mean, Grady, you probably use more coconut oil than I know of anybody.
Yeah.
But but that being said, in this blanket statement of insulin sensitivity, more animal based longer chains might be better than medium chains, but medium chains have a place in the research as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for the most part, as long as you're getting, at least to me, as long as you're getting good sources of those fats, you're going to have a pretty good combination, because any source of fat is not going to just have one type of fatty acid in it. It's going to have a varying amount of different fatty acids in it. So coconut oil isn't 100% saturated fatty acids. And for the most part, neither are animal sources. However, they are mostly saturated. So when you're looking at the foods that you're eating for fats, you're going to be getting a combination of a lot of those things. So looking at the sources of those things is really important, and not just trying to focus in on one specific fatty acid, because like with coconut oil, it does say in here, and the general consensus is yes, there is a lot of medium chain fatty acids in coconut oil, but at the same time it has a lot of other things in it. So that's why you have MCT oil that's being pushed a lot right now, because that's the isolated down version of coconut oil, because it's just trying to isolate all those medium chain fatty acids versus having the whole complex of fatty acids in the coconut oil. So I just wanted to point that out too.
On a side note, just because I think it's something that you would do, and a lot of people should do it, but it's not surprising that you do some of these things. What is probably the most interesting use of coconut oil that you use coconut oil for? Obviously, this review article is talking about diet, so I'm gonna say exclude diet in this
Exclude
answer.
diet. All right. So there's a couple of things. I won't say they're the most interesting things that I've ever used them for. However, they are pretty useful. Um, yeah. So some of them are I've made um, uh, deodorant with it. I make my toothpaste with it.
What?
Yeah, I make my own toothpaste. And then one of the best things that I use coconut oil for is my skin, whether it's dry skin. But one of the best things and the most effective things I use it for is actually sunburn. So I use a combination of two things. So if I know I'm going to be out in the sun for a really long time, don't use coconut oil before you go out in the sun, because you will probably burn worse than you would without it.
I was about to say, I feel like you would just bake, like you
Oh
would
yeah,
just literally lather out this oil and just get destroyed.
yeah. I've tried it before. It didn't work out too good. But however, I will, if I know I'm going to be outside for a long time and I'm a pretty pale person anyways, I will put on carrot oil, and that actually does help with the sun. Now, with the carrot oil, after you get out of the sun, it looks like you are burnt. However, when I put coconut oil on afterwards,
Mm-hmm.
I'll wake up the next day totally gone. Like almost like I'll get maybe have a little bit of a tan, but like almost not even a tan.
Wow.
So that combination I found works really well. I don't have, and even if I do get sunburn, like I forget to put on the carrot oil or I'm out like super long and I get burnt, if I put the coconut oil on and be pretty religious about it, I don't get the stinging, I don't get the heat, and I don't really peel hardly at all.
Do you use a combo, or have you ever tried combo of like aloe and coconut oil?
No, I for a while I was using a lot of aloe and combinations of different things with aloe. Um, and then, one time I just used straight up coconut oil because that's all I had at the time. And man, it did the trick way better than anything I had tried before with like
Mm.
combinations of different things. So I'm like, hey, just keep it simple. Just get a jar of coconut oil, dip my finger in there and just rub it in.
I'm sorry. Like, I hope you didn't mind sharing that. Obviously, we didn't plan on talking about that, but I think it's something interesting that you do that people could try or worth trying. And
Mm-hmm.
I just remember seeing when we were living together in St. Louis, you come back from whether it be golfing or mowing the lawn, and you just like take your coconut oil out and you just
Yeah.
start lathering on. I'm like, what is this guy doing?
Yep.
Um, and so that's just another thought of using food as medicine as well as context matters, right? Like you're literally
Mm-hmm.
using nutrients of natural food, coconut oil, and putting it on your skin, dermis, part of like an organ, and
Mm-hmm.
it absorbs that, uses that for detoxification processes, for healing processes in a way that most would never even think to do. Is carrot oil easily accessible? Like
It's a little bit harder to find, obviously, than coconut oil.
get from like
But I think
Amazon?
I found it on Amazon, so yeah,
Okay.
it shouldn't be too big of a deal.
Gotcha. At the top of your head, can you talk like, do you know like any kind of mechanism of how like coconut oil on the epidermis of the skin, like, or to damage skin? Could you comment on any of that? And you can say you plead the fifth. That's okay. We can just move on
Yeah,
as well.
I've never dug too deep into it.
Okay.
So yeah.
All right. So, ladies, if you want to meet Dr. Donohoe's coconut oily skin, send us an email at the diebuddiespodcast@gmail.com.
There you go.
Anyways, let's move on, right? So that was some commentary on high fat. We've openly said how polyunsaturated fats, there's a lot of data for how that might be better for insulin sensitivity resistance. We've kind of talked a little bit how that's true, but so are other things. But moving on to something that I think everyone, no matter what camp you're in, can agree on is the combination of high fat, high sugar, or high sucrose.
Mm-hmm.
What commonly is used in dietary induced obesity, or just represents the SAD diet or standard American diet,
Mm-hmm.
is high fat, high carbs, high fat, high sugar. So let's take some moments and talk about that.
Yeah, yeah, and they pretty much. I mean, I think this section is pretty short in their article because I mean everybody can agree on it. It's not a big surprise that combination of high fat and high sugar is going to drive you into metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance so much quicker than anything else. Because like we
Mm-hmm.
talked about before, when you combine sugar and fat, the body just wants to store all that away.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes immediately into storing the fat away and then trying to process all that sugar and converting it into fat. So
Mm-hmm.
you're going to be creating a lot of different metabolic problems when you do that. And when that happens, your insulin resistance shoots way up super quick. And I think they even go into how now, when they do diet induced obesity for rat studies or what have you, they use more so now a high fat and high sugar diet to get those mice in that metabolic syndrome much faster now.
Yep. Yep. You know, it was they say right here, this in the late 80s is when they really realized this, that using this type of diet is can induce um, metabolic syndrome. In fact, that they state it's sufficient to produce many of the pathophysiological changes in the metabolic syndrome pathway. And as well as, I think this point is really interesting about it too, is that, and it can bring up a good talking point, is that in particular, the study was done on a strain of rat. Yeah, rat, right? Yeah, strain of mice. Sorry, strain of mice labeled. And for anybody else, this is what I do when I read an article for the first time. If it seems weird and not important, I just bypass it. So you can do that while I'm saying this. But the strain of mice is C57BL/6J.
Oh
And
yeah, that one.
so, yeah, of course. And anyways, but what they also realized with this strain of mice, that they are predisposed and easier to get diet-induced obesity than other strains of mice. And so that can lead into the conversation of genetically predisposed and therefore epigenetics as well. These mice, if not fed this diet, would not be fat, right? They specifically are feeding them, and they're using this strain because they are more likely to get fat when feeding this. They have a preloaded gun, and that diet then can change their genetic profile in a way where their phenotype or their physical expression ends up being obesity much faster than other strains of mice. Or for that, you can think about other groups of people, other genetics. And this idea of epigenetics and predisposition that is definitely more accepted, this past decade of epigenetics compared to not. What I'm getting at is that the diets you choose because of our genetics and predisposition can have a drastic impact on our expression of health. And that includes high fat, high sucrose. That would include high fat. Some people actually can't do a high fat diet because they can't express the actual lipocarriers in a certain way. Like, there are reasons why some people thrive on diets and some people don't. And I think that just should be highlighted too.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, and it comes back, like that stimulates thought in my head about the whole, well, the rest of my family has heart disease or diabetes, so I will probably get it. And it always breaks my heart when I hear that, because that's not the full story. You aren't just born with diabetes, or type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome, or those things. You, for the most part, end up earning that title. So it's not the full story, and never count yourself out. You gotta first of all take control of your health, take responsibility for your health. And yes, it is going to be harder for some people than others to maintain proper health. And it just takes consistency. And so I think bringing up the point that it's not just about your genetics, it's also about your epigenetics. And your epigenetics are your choices day in, day out. And that's ultimately more important than your genetics, because you can turn on and turn off genes with your choices.
Yep, exactly. And you've now, it's almost not beating dead horse, but like you said, the consistency, your choices, you have the control of what's going on with all this stuff. And it's very clear how high fructose and high sucrose and high carb combination with high diet can alter these things. But it should be empowering, the fact that you can change these things. It actually reminds me a little bit, that phrase of not phrase. So for anybody, I'm a big fan of a show called BoJack Horseman, and so to describe a scene real fast, the guy was they were talking about happiness, and so it was like, oh, like, you have the power to be happy. Like, you can control that. You have the responsibility. Like, you have the ability to do that. It's like, I don't want to be responsible for my own happiness. I'm not even responsible enough to like stay sober enough for like 5 hours, like says the character in the show. But that responsibility can be scary, but at the same time, it really should be empowering.
Mm-hmm.
That you can overcome these things, and it doesn't have to be a life sentence. Especially, that also makes me think of not just type 2 diabetes, but type 1 diabetes, right? So in terms of patterns that you're observing yourself with your glucose, and no, so if you are putting in the work, you are getting the data, whether it be CGM data, or you're checking your sugar, you're tracking things, you might notice patterns, and those patterns are because you're predisposed to react a certain way, and because then what you're eating then makes you act a certain way. We've kind of talked about it, how comparing you and I in the gym, if we're lifting heavy, you typically will always go down
Mm-hmm.
if you're lifting heavy and strenuous, because of me and how wound up my nervous system is, and just that's almost like part of my genetics and just my personality, my being, that like how wound up I am. I'm going to be releasing more cortisol probably than you, and we're releasing more epinephrine. That's going to raise my glucose, and so I actually have a higher chance of raising my blood sugar while strength training than you. And but then I can alter certain things in my diet and epigenetically and change things and take that power back and have a different result. But everyone's not cut and dry the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, and um, I would also encourage people not to get frustrated trying to compare yourself with other people, because even though you see somebody who can eat pizza all day long and still stay skinny as a pole, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're metabolically healthy. They may look healthy on the outside, but that person still, if they're eating a bunch of crap, they're going to have a lot of inflammation. They're going to have a lot of physiologic problems in their body because of that. And like I said, for some people, it's going to be harder than others, but ultimately it comes down to consistency. If you're consistently eating a diet congruent with your health, you're consistently following a exercise routine that's consistent with your goals and your health, then you're going to be winning in life and in your health. And so always stay focused on what your goals are, and not try and just compare yourself to somebody that's totally different, whether genetically or physiologically at that time.
true words, Grady. True words. So I think that's enough about the epigenetic soapbox and taking control of it.
Yes.
So anything else you want to say about high fructose, or I keep saying fructose, I don't know why right out, just high sugar, high fat. Maybe can you describe like what that means and why it's similar to a standard American diet? Like, what is that? Let's maybe put some context and not just say this thing is bad, but like
Mm-hmm.
to anybody who's just kind of moving through life without more of a science background, like what does that mean to everyday person? What is the standard American diet, and why does it represent a high fat, high sugar diet?
Yeah. So basically, a high fat, high sugar diet. When I think of it, I think about pizza, because you have a lot of carbs in there and you have a lot of fat in there. You have a lot of greasy um, oils in there. And well, most of those oils are pretty inflammatory as well. So you're getting a lot of bad combinations there. And so when you're eating both high carb and high fat, you are ingesting a lot of calories and a lot of fuel. And if you don't need all that fuel, then your body has to store that away. And so most of the time, you're going to be storing that away as fat. And not only the fat part of that, but then on top of that, if you're having a lot of carbs on top of that, and your body doesn't need all those carbs, then it has to store that away as well. So now you're adding on top of that fat storage. And so that whole combination is a recipe for developing a lot of metabolic conditions, because when you start adding fat, fat is not just a storage unit. Fat does a lot of metabolic things. It does a lot of hormonal things, and it does a lot of immune things. So it releases cytokines, which are chemical messengers for the immune system that essentially target or tell the immune system where to target inflammation. And then you also have the hormonal interactions with the sex hormones, converting testosterone into estrogen and estrogen into testosterone. So the more fat you develop and store away, the more those things are going to be coming into play, because those fat cells are getting bigger, and then eventually those fat cells are going to reproduce and create more fat cells, and then you have more opportunities for all of those scenarios to then drive more of those problems.
Yeah. And you use the example of pizza to describe all of that, but it's not just pizza. I think plenty of people know that pizza is just bad, right?
Yeah.
And that for all those reasons, and then the mechanism that you just described. Actually, my go-to when I think about that is ice cream,
Yeah.
because it's more simple sugars than pizza, but
Yeah.
But then there's a lot of high fat in most ice creams too. But it's literally almost, when we think of American diet, probably you're going to think about fast food, takeout, bar food, KFC. You're getting the awful fats and the deep fried, and then you're throwing on mashed potatoes, throwing on all these high carbs. You're throwing in cake. You're throwing in all these things that have a combination of high fat, high carb. You think about a burger from McDonald's, bun, fries, carbs, shake, and bad fats in the oil, bad fats that the fries were cooked in. Then you think about even what might be healthy, and somebody, let's say it's not very fat heavy on the outside, but really everything is cooked in oil or sauteed in a bad oil, and you're having then rice on the side of it or something else, and then you're not moving the way you need to move, and so you're metabolically predisposed to not be able to handle that type of fat and that type of carb at the same time. What American style food is taking a bunch of then other cultures. You can think of then eating Italian food. You can think about eating Mexican and Hispanic food, that it's more American styled, which means more fat, more carbs. Like the bread in America is so much sugary. So it's complex and simple sugar. And then you throw like Crisco or whatever, gross butter, on it, and then it just doesn't make sense. I remember when I first went low carb, really low carb for the first time, and I just cut out grains, cut out carbs, and I could smell the sugar in bread.
Oh yeah.
I'd be sitting next to me, or somebody would be sitting next to me, and I would look at them, and they're eating a sandwich, and it's just like a deli sandwich that they made themselves. They got the deli meat, they got all of it. It looks like a pretty balanced, like My Plate, which is an awful suggestion, My Plate.
Yeah.
But it looks like a standard My Plate type of diet, and I can literally smell the sugar that is within the bread. And it's just, there's so much sugar in everywhere and everything. And then so the standard American diet is essentially eating in this country, in America. There's some people listen to this not in America, so anyways, but essentially eating here without thinking about it, you're going to be eating high fat, high carb if you're not consciously trying to think about what are you eating and why.
Yeah, and they kind of talk about this in this article where they talk about cafeteria diets, which is basically a choice diet. You choose what you eat. It doesn't really matter. They're not strict on like eating high fat or low carb or whatever. It's just whatever is in the cafeteria, you get to choose from it. And essentially, it comes down to the same thing as high fat and high sugar, because ultimately, those are the things that taste good. If you have a lot of carbs and a lot of sugar and you combine them, typically those foods are very tasty. And you can argue if it's built into our systems to where we crave those things because they are big energy reservoirs, because fat has a lot of energy in it, and also sugar is very quick burning, and so our bodies tend to crave those things, and our taste buds are typically geared towards craving those things because of that reason.
Yeah. And I think that this idea, because this is probably the first time I've seen in literature, like what's labeled a cafeteria diet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, you go to college, or you're in, not even in college, but maybe you're in like a summer camp. If you're lucky enough to do that type of thing, and you go to literally the cafeteria, and you have all these options. What's going to happen? You're going to probably eat the food that tastes the best,
Mm-hmm.
but it's probably the worst for you, right? And so it's almost like a different way of phrasing the South American diet and this high fructose. Yes, I did again. High carb, high sugar, high fat diet. But it almost adds a little more psychology to it, which is important. Then, I was actually just telling somebody, I was like, man, the psychology, like the literature on psychology, is like I can't even comment on because that's not my field. But as just practitioners of nutrition, working people holistically, we need to think about it in some way, and the power of choice, the power of free will. Ooh, do we want to go down this rabbit hole of free will right now, Grady?
No,
That's a no. Anyways,
that's
but
a rabbit hole.
yeah, but rabbits don't. Anyways, okay. I'm just gonna move on. I agree with what you said. It's an interesting concept, having the choice of, strictly only one type of food. Maybe that's only high carb versus having a combination. That's essentially what they did with these rodents. These rodents were able to eat a combination at their leisure, chow that was high in beef, particles, and high in protein and high carb, and then had a combination of carbs and fats, so they could kind of nibble on whatever they wanted. And they had worse glucose disposal, meaning almost glucose utilization, right? They weren't
Mm-hmm.
able to dispose the glucose and use it in a way, than animals that only had access to one chow. And that group ends up showing better hepatic glucose production, which is a marker then, like we talked about, of liver or hepatic insulin resistance. So interesting statement when they wrote this in the article, just because those are almost two different like ways of characterizing insulin resistance, but yet they combine in the same sentence. But again, not even literature is straightforward, because you would think you would want to comment on it if it's the same thing, but here we are.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's move on to high carb, the straight high carb diet. So this would be pretty hard to do. Just somebody's literally eating carbohydrates, or
Mm-hmm.
mostly carbohydrates, like not eating a lot of protein, not eating a lot. It would literally be like eating fruits and bread and grains, and like you eat a lot of rice. Just literally high carbohydrate diets.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think when you read about and what they had to say about high carbohydrate diets?
So I think they talk a lot about how um, typically, or at least in what they found, that a lot of these diets will help with insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance, um, and obviously we have our biases with the lower carb, but at the same time, I think we talked about this last time, but as long as you're, for the most part, on one side or the other, the combination of high fat and high carbs is really the worst. When you start to isolate and get closer to one end of the spectrum or the other, typically your blood sugar regulation is going to be much better. And so that's kind of what they show here, and for the most part, it's in regards to insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance. And the reason I think that they go into this so much is because, for the most part, at least what they state in their study, is they're going mainly off of the euglycemic clamp, which is basically, the euglycemic clamp is essentially they're giving a dose of insulin to essentially drop the blood sugar, and then they're infusing glucose to try and maintain it at a certain level, so they can compare how much insulin versus how much glucose it's taking um, to keep that blood sugar level level, and that's how they're determining the insulin resistance level, essentially. And so in that regard, when you're eating purely glucose or carbohydrates, your body's going to become very efficient at utilizing those carbohydrates and trying to get those into the cells. And so it's going to be a glucose burning machine, and we've talked about fat burning machines before. So essentially, obviously, your insulin resistance is going to be better. However, it again comes back to the context. What are you eating in regards to those high carbohydrate diets? Are you eating a lot of processed sugars? Are you eating a lot of vegetables or fruits? And that comes into a big play, because if you're eating just straight up refined sugars, the story is going to be a little bit different than it is if you're going to be eating a lot of vegetables.
It's almost like in my mind, I don't even like, obviously vegetables are carbohydrates, but like I also consider vegetables carbohydrates, right? Like in America, we have, in the United States, there are so many carbs in not the form of carrots, in the form of spinach, in the forms of broccoli, in the form of whatever have you. And like it's just mind blowing to me, the 90-day difference of processed sugars versus natural sugars.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
definitely.
mm-hmm. Go on. You're about to say something.
Yeah, because I like that you brought up the carrots, because I have a lot of people, either or several people, who are trying to go keto or on the low carb spectrum, and um, we go over different foods and stuff like that. And some people are concerned about carrots or certain
Mm-hmm.
vegetables in regards to how much sugar is in them. And for the most part, like you said, I'm not too worried about carrots. If you're eating carrots and you're worried about your blood sugar spiking from those, I think you're doing pretty good. If
Right.
if you're eating, obviously like ice cream, it's going to be way different. Or even just like a candy bar that doesn't have a lot of fat in it and just has sugar, you're going to be way better off with that carrot, even if they have the same amount of sugar in it, because you have fiber in there. You also have good nutrients in there that's going to affect your metabolism and just your overall physiology. And so the context of what you're looking at is really important, because the high carb, or sorry, the low carb, you can get caught up in being, I think, too extreme, to where you're just like, really focused on super low carb. Like, I can't eat this many carrots because, hey, that's going to put me over that 50 grams per day that I'm allowed. Um, so for me, like, and that's where it comes down to when I talk about like cheating. Like, if you're cheating on carrots, I'm pretty happy with that. If you're cheating on ice cream, I'm not too happy about that.
Mm-hmm. But and carrots have a satisfying crunch,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I mean, there's a lot of benefits to just nibbling on carrots. But yeah, I agree. I remember, a couple years ago, somebody was asking me something similar. Um, can I have carrots on keto? I'm like, of course. Like, you're not trying, especially if you're not trying to measure your ketones. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you're literally just trying the diet, you're just starting out, eat as many carrots as you want. I will say with the type 1 that it is obviously then a little different, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think both you and I have had glucose spikes when we don't eat a lot of carbs. We are eating the carrots, and we're really effective at putting those carbohydrates in and digesting them, breaking them up, and putting it in our blood. Because I've
Mm-hmm.
definitely had to give insulin for carrots. I'm sure you have too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when again, it comes down to the context of the situation that you're in too, because like you said, if you've been eating super low carb and then you go and add carrots in, if especially if you're type 1 diabetic, you're probably going to notice a bigger change than if you were eating a bunch of like high carb meals, whether that's pasta or pizza or ice cream or whatever it is, if you're kind of eating that pretty consistently, and then you eat a bunch of carrots, your blood sugar is probably going to be pretty good, and maybe even dropping because your body's not spiking as much because it's going to be more level. And it has a way better or way different effect on the overall physiology in the body. And so, again, it comes back to that context. And at the same time, it also depends on, your exercise levels. Like, I've eaten carrots, around the window of exercising, and I don't really have to take any insulin for it. Whereas, like, if I don't work out that day, or I, need a snack later at night and I haven't been that active for several hours, then it's a little bit different story. I will have to take probably a little bit more insulin than I would normally.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, context matters. I think that's going to be the title of this episode. This context matters.
Yep.
Much shorter than our last title.
Last title was pretty long.
Yeah, it was. But yeah, no, I agree. And, kind of going back to the article, I almost want to do it justice because it does ring home, and you've said it, but it does say the benefits of being on a high carb diet, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that it does show, and there is research out there that, having high sucrose, high fructose, and just high carb can positively impact overall insulin reduction of insulin resistance. But I thought this part was interesting, and that I'll just read it straight off the article. The fructose, and mostly, so the fructose part of sucrose. So when you're eating high carb and when you're eating sucrose, the fructose part of it, because sucrose is a combination of glucose and fructose. The fructose part of the sucrose seems to be the main driver of loss of insulin action possibly because, so even that I just was saying how there is evidence to say that can positively impact insulin resistance. There's obviously data that says otherwise too.
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, the fructose part of sucrose can be the main driver of loss of insulin action, possibly because of its preferential metabolism in the liver and subsequent increase in liver lipids as a result. The molecular mechanisms behind insulin resistance caused by dietary fructose are mainly focused on the strong hypertriglycemia, or in other words, high triglycerides, hypertriglyceridemia, and hepatic lipid accumulation, explained in detail by another author in an article. So I think that's interesting too, because there is data on the dangers of fructose and where's fructose in fruit. But I don't think you and I would say that you should avoid fruit. I don't think anyone should ever feel guilty for eating fruit. So I have seen people online that say, like, you should never eat fruit because fructose is bad. Well, fructose in high fructose corn syrup is bad. Fructose in your ketchup is bad. But and obviously fructose in these studies are more concentrated. So that's almost comparing apples to oranges. No fruit, pun intended. But I think if you were eating a banana, you shouldn't feel bad for that. If you're eating mangoes, you shouldn't feel bad for that if they're fresh mangoes. That should be the sweets that you have. When you have low blood sugar, it shouldn't be eat a Snickers.
Mm-hmm.
It should be have low blood sugar, eat a mango.
Mm-hmm.
Or blueberries in your case, or my case, it's easy to devour a million of them at once and drink most of them.
Yep.
So I don't know. I think that was an interesting part of the fructose, that possibly the reason why it can affect insulin action is because essentially it helps accumulate liver lipids and triglycerides within the liver, and therefore insulin resistance within the liver. I thought that was an interesting point that they made.
Yeah. And coming back to the fruit discussion again, it depends on what your goals are with your diet. If you are trying to go keto, and then you start adding in lots of fruits with that, then you can get into a situation where you're kind of fighting your body with that, and you're getting into like a high fat, high carb type situation. It's not necessarily as bad as the SAD diet or the standard American diet, because it has good sources of carbs and fat. But at the same time, if your goal is to lose weight or change your insulin resistance or what have you, um, then eating lots of fruit may not be good. Like you said, if you're going to cheat on something, fruit is way better than anything else. So like, especially when your taste buds are trying to change over into eating lots of carbohydrates into low carbohydrates, then yes, you may have to supplement some fruits in there to help get your craving, so that that way you're not going crazy late at night when you're craving ice cream. So again, it comes back to context and using some of those strategies to help make yourself more successful, and understanding that the diet should be driven by your goals, and trying to follow that is really important too. And then another thing I wanted to bring up with this whole thing, especially with the high carb diet, you also have to take a big step back and look at the overall picture of the human body with this diet. Because if we're eating, a plant-based diet and not having a lot of animal protein in there, then you have to start, navigating and wondering and trying to figure out which nutrients are you not getting because you don't have animal proteins in your diet. So that's another thing that you need to be thinking about, not only insulin resistance and blood sugar metabolism, but then also the overall function in the body. Because even though blood sugar is very important, it's not the full picture. So you have to make sure that overall your body is going to be working better. So making sure you're getting all the nutrients that you need, and trying to bring down inflammation if you need to, or whatever your goals are with your health. You need to also take a big step back and make sure that everything fits with what you're doing.
Yeah, no, I think you said a whole bunch of things there that are really, really important. The first and foremost, that's more general, your diet should reflect your goals.
Mm-hmm.
Like, don't just follow something that just because it's a fad. Don't follow something because that's what you think you should supposed to. Don't follow something even because something said made you feel bad for not doing it. You shouldn't, just because all your friends are only eating keto, you shouldn't just eat keto. Just because some friends, are very hardcore vegetarian vegan because they ethically make the argument of supporting animals and, try to make arguments for, saving the earth, whatever have you, doesn't mean you should do it. It should be based on your goals,
Mm-hmm.
Isn't the whole picture.
Yeah.
It's so easy. It's like, this is a diabetes podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Literally the whole point of what we're always trying to talk about is diabetes and type 1 and type 2 and pre-diabetes, and avoiding a world where in 2050 by the CDC 1 in 3 people have diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's literally our missions, and that's like literally our purpose here on earth is diabetes, you and I. But that's not the whole picture.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you just said. And it's so easy as a diabetic to only care about insulin, only to care about glucose, only think what insulin does in the context of your blood sugar on your Dexcom or on your Guardian or on your free Libri or whatever have you. That's not the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
How you digest food, how you move through life, your bowel movements, your thyroid function, all kidney function, so many things. That metabolism is the fire that fuels all these things, but your body is more than just metabolism. I mean, we'll just say yes to that. So keeping a healthy nervous system, keeping a healthy immune system. It's 2020. Everyone's trying to talk about the immune system right now,
Mm-hmm.
which is intertwined with the nervous and endocrine system, and those are tied in with everything and anything else anyways.
Mm-hmm.
So not to only hyper focus on your insulin, on your glucose, and what makes that better, but what makes your quality of life better? What makes you healthier overall? What can you stick to? What can you be happy about? What's going to bring you joy? Because the psychology of all of this and how you think about these things. And like, if you're super, super strained and you're like, even that I've been doing it for 5 months, I hate the fact that I can't eat meat, or even that I've been doing it for 5 months, I hate the fact I can't have fruit. Like, that's literally going to impact everything else about your quality of life
Mm-hmm.
and your health. So, yes. All right. I also wanted to say more points on the section of high carb diet. Then we'll move on to variations in protein, and then we'll probably wrap it up from there. So I wanted to read this point because this one statement by these authors compares this high carb diet, right, or this high carb diet. So from few comparative studies published, it seems likely that in rodents, a high-fat diet and a high-fat, high sucrose diet generates a greater degree of insulin resistance than high sucrose / fructose diets. And that's shown in a couple different articles, I think 2 in the table that they reference. So they're saying, even that we have put disclaimers on what a high-fat diet means, even that we said probably high-fat, high sucrose is probably the worst diet, there's some research out there that says maybe that high fructose and high carb might be better for you for insulin action, which is one small component of your life, than high-fat diet and the SAD diet. Now, I definitely would argue against the SAD diet part, but there's arguments and then arguments to make holes of when comparing the high-fat diet. But that's what these authors said. And so sometimes you just need to respect what's there. But I think this point about comparing high-fat and high-carb diets is really interesting, right? You and I were talking about this a little bit beforehand because they say this in this article. So the energy of fat and carbs are different. If we talk about it in calories, right, it's 4 calories versus 9 calories, more energy in fat storage than there is carbs. In this article, they refer to it as kilojoules. So, it's a different form of heat measurement. But anyways, to supplement the difference in calories, sometimes in these comparative studies of high fat diet to high carb diets, they literally add fiber, and they add calories in the form of starch and fiber to therefore try to equal the high fat diet to make it a control, because you want to control as many variables as possible in a study. But what these authors even comment on is when you do that, you're literally adding fiber and starch that's going to affect your gut differently. It's going to affect your microbe different. So how can you're adding something to add a control, but yet you are changing the profile of somebody's microbiome or a rat mouse's microbiome by adding fiber and starch that are going to feed off that differently than just fat. Maybe that's the point of it. Maybe that's saying, oh, well, having more carbs, you're likely to do that. But that's still apples to oranges. Again, ignore the fruit pun.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's just a really interesting point, that a lot of these studies add that to equal one another, but changes it drastically.
Yeah, you're adding something to try and get rid of a variable, but in reality, you're probably actually creating more variables as a result. And at the same time, coming back to my other argument about at least what they state in the article is that they're going mainly off of the euglycemic clamp as well. So it's not necessarily the full picture in regard to insulin resistance and insulin sensitivity too. So again, understanding the context of the article will help you better understand how it's actually being applied, and what's actually being said in the article without trying to being influenced by what the authors are saying. So I like what you said about bringing up the difference in the amount of fat in each diet too, because with these studies, how do we know if, because we could look through each one of these articles that they cite, but there's like a billion of them, to see exactly what percentage of fat they were using for this comparison of high carb and high fat and insulin resistance. And because like you said, there could be a scenario where they're using this high fat diet, but in reality, it's almost like a high fat, high sugar diet, because it's only, like they said, only 20% of your calories were from fat. So
Good
how
point.
is,
Yeah.
how is that not a sad diet? Um,
Yeah.
so so yeah, it's hard to dissect all of this review article because of that reason. And not everything's super clear with that. So again, always remember the context of what's being said in the article, and also the context of what your body is going through too.
Mm. And almost to play, that was a great point to, talk about what we brought up earlier about the 20% thing. But to almost to play devil's advocate, right? We poke holes at people bashing on high fat diets by saying, well, what fats were they using?
Mm-hmm.
And then we would argue, the more peanut oils, the more soy oils, the more vegetable oils, canola oils, those types of things would of course, have less of a favorable result in studies, right? Like that's
Mm-hmm.
like how we poke holes in things. But then somebody could say, like, as I'm trying to call out, well, you're using fiber, you're
Mm-hmm.
using, and then they might be like, that's the point. Like, we are then therefore changing the microbiome. Like, that's the advantage. And then
Mm-hmm.
you could say, well, how is that changing the microbiome? Like, what species are you altering? And then some expert that could come in and say, yeah, high carb is good because you get to add these things in, and this bacteria is getting, this yeast is going down, this yeast is going up, this bacteria is going up, this bacteria is going down. And so therefore they can poke holes in a similar way, and that we can poke holes at what type of fat it is.
Mm-hmm.
So just playing devil's advocate and keeping that in mind, I think, is important too as we move through things and as we try to discover what's best for yourself, in this case, what's best for you and I, what's best for our patients, whatever have you.
Mm-hmm.
Because everyone can poke holes at everything, but I think we need to be able to think through it
Yeah.
and what's actually going on. So, I think moving forward, that's a good place to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and ultimately, like in my practice, for the most part, like I am biased towards lower carbohydrates. So for the most part, that's what I have people focus on. But at the same time, I have some people who think more towards that, not necessarily high carb, but like vegan or vegetarian. They their mind or their brain is more, it's more congruent with their way of thinking. And so I say, okay, let's try it, and we'll try it in the most beneficial way possible, still cutting out as much of the processed stuff as we can, eating the best version of that diet that we can to help improve your function, and we'll see how it works. Some people, I will say, for the most part, it hasn't worked for a lot of people. But I give them that opportunity, and we try to do the best we can with it. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't, then we'll try something else.
That's really cool to hear. Have you had anybody have some success, in the practices that you've had?
Um, in some areas, yes, but overall, for the most part, other systems in the body just don't work as well because of it. So right now, at this point, I mean, I'm only 2 years in. At this point, I haven't had a patient that does well on like a vegan or a vegetarian diet, but they're out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. Cool. All right, so let's talk about protein and then wrap it up with some, you know, diabetic wins. So In this article, they then talk about how varying proteins and altering dietary protein can therefore change your metabolic profile and glucose, tolerance and insulin sensitivity, resistance, things like that. So, what do you think about this section of the article?
Yeah, so with the proteins, I thought it was really good that they brought this up. There was one specific quote that I had, or maybe not a quote, maybe more of a generalization, that the source of the protein really mattered because they compared fish protein and casein and soy protein. So fish protein actually enhanced insulin sensitivity when
Mm-hmm.
compared to casein and soy. And casein is dairy protein, if you aren't familiar with that.
Yeah, say that again for the people in the back.
Yeah, so fish protein, when they compared that with casein or soy, actually enhanced insulin sensitivity.
Mm. And I think that's really important too, because at least here in the United States, I would say probably majority of people. That would probably be a hard majority line, but I don't think we eat enough fish. Fish is expensive. The type of fish isn't readily available, and
Mm-hmm.
so eating fish is a really beneficial type of protein, right? But yet the casein from dairy and milk and cheese or soy protein, which people try then if they're avoiding dairy or they're avoiding, they are vegetarian, trying to get soy because of the completeness and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's more of a complete, that's more of a beneficial for insulin sensitivity. But yet we don't eat them. Like I definitely don't buy fish nearly as much as I buy beef, turkey, chicken.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't know about you, but
Yeah,
well, I
yeah.
do know about you. I lived with you for 3 something years, so I do know about you. But our listeners don't. So you talk about you.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll sprinkle it in here and there, but definitely it's not high on my grocery list. Um, so yeah, I don't eat a ton of fish, but at the same time, like supplementing omega-3s is how I get those good fatty acids, because I think that also plays a role in what's going on here, because they referenced earlier in the article that supplementing omega-3s helps with insulin sensitivity. So the
Mm-hmm.
reason, seeing that the fish enhances insulin sensitivity isn't a big surprise because of that.
Yep, yep. And part of the proposed mechanism, and it's almost kind of hard to talk about just proteins generally like this, because of different amino acid profiles, which they do comment on. But essentially, early work and early studies with looking at proteins and insulin sensitivity suggest that increase both expression and then translocation of GLUT4, which is that door in muscle, liver, fat, that Matsu zinc door to get glucose into those cells, is increased. Oh, and well, I guess now that I'm looking at my notes again, specifically the article references muscle. So, but I was just giving a refresher on where you can find GLUT4.
Mm-hmm.
But the this may be due to different effects of specific amino acids and amino acid profiles in the proteins and things like that. And that actually reminded me of, do you remember when I was trying to do my own case study on myself with protein powders and amino acids?
Yep.
So there's so many amino acids out there and they can affect you differently. The most amino acids are glucogenic, which have the potential to turn to glucose. Few are glucoketogenic, which could both turn to glucose or ketones, and even less are only ketogenic, meaning those amino acids, when it comes to turning into different things, will only turn into ketones. Now, also, there are different properties of different types of amino acids and how they can be used, as well as how the body uses them. You know, Tyrosine kinases are parts of enzymes, amino acids on enzymes that are part of the insulin signaling pathway, and tyrosine is therefore amino acid. I take glutamine all the time for the healing of my gut lining. There are different types of amino acids that can elicit different things. But this case study I tried doing on myself was I wanted to, first, when I was realizing that whey protein, me specifically, was god awful for my blood sugar. Like it raised it like no other. Given the control, or I had to start separating control. I was trying to do a case study myself, like 3 samples of like me taking protein powder at like 15 grams, 25 grams, 50 grams, 75 grams, like different scoops of protein powder. And then once I started doing it, I was doing it in the morning after I was working out. And sometimes my workout would be like 2 workouts, and I'd be doing a HIIT workout. And I already talked about how my HIIT workouts like raise my blood sugar. So the result was Dr. Grady, when we were both in school, convinced me to stop because my blood sugars were getting trashed. And I was just like, you can physically see the difference on my face and my skin and on my like everything about me, that I was not feeling good for a long time. And but I was trying to document on me personally with lots of trials how different amounts of protein affected me. And then I also wanted different protein powders, which would have different amino acid profiles, and track how that affected my blood sugar. And if I did that in a controlled way, I there could see, because there's not a lot of studies on this. I remember extensively like going on PubMed, going on other Google Scholar, all these of how each amino acid raises blood sugar differently. There's not a whole lot of research on that. So I was trying to do it on myself. And then it was just really hard. There's a reason why we don't use humans in a lot of these studies, because ethically, A, it's bad. B, you put people at harm. And C, you waste a lot of good protein powder because, gains.
It's important.
But this all wraps up the point of amino acids, different amino acids, and in different combinations, even at different times, give you different effects on your blood sugar through metabolic pathways, through insulin sensitivity, through glucose sparing, through all these different ways. And that's really important. You can use that to your advantage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And going over the protein sources and seeing which ones your body processes better is really important. I think we talked a little bit either last time or the time before about the different protein powders, because with protein powders, it's pretty much already digested for you. And so it's going to be absorbed much faster. And so seeing how that affects your body versus having an animal source of protein, and also the different sources of those powders, because not only can you have sometimes immune reactions to different forms of protein, but at the same time you can absorb things differently as well, so they can affect blood sugar in many different ways. And so seeing which ones are congruent with your body and your goals, because some powders may help with certain things, but then in other areas of your body like digestion or different immune things, they may not be really beneficial. So finding the best one for you. And I'll say, just off of my experience with working with patients, it seems like the bone broth protein and or collagen protein seems to be do pretty well with a lot of people, at least in regards especially to their immune system. It doesn't react as much as a lot of the other protein powders.
Yeah, I was watching YouTube video of another doc. Somebody asked him about collagen protein, and he's like, it's just a gimmick. But again, context is everything. Mm-hmm. You just said in the context of your immune system, mm-hmm. right? So there you go. That's 99 difference of somebody just generally asking, should I take collagen, mm-hmm. versus what will help me balance my immune system and is more immune neutral.
Yeah.
You're finding in your practice bone broth and collagen type proteins is really safe, so that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure that question, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of people will take collagen because of skin health or something like that, and so
it's a problem.
Yeah, so there's probably not as much science around that, and it's not like you're going to drink a bunch of collagen protein and then have perfect skin either, but having a good healthy immune system can have a lot of different effects throughout the body.
Right. Yeah, and that's essentially what that doc that I was watching was. He was like, well, collagen has a lot of biotin, and biotin can help things like hair growth, skin, whatever, but that's only if you have a deficiency. We get plenty in the US, like blah 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 blah, which is all true things. But yes, so he was making an assumption based on a very short question, but having the right context, maybe he would have answered differently, and you framed your answer within a specific context too. Yep. So okay, we're getting close to an hour and a half of recording time. So let's round out, third base going towards home for, some diabetic wins. So what's a diabetic win for you there, Grady?
Yeah,
Recently.
so recently, I've talked about this before, but I've been working out more and working out more consistently. So I've also upped my protein intake in response to that. And the last several weeks, I've been really hungry at night, and so I've been eating a lot of animal protein at fairly late at night because I've been working out after I get done from work, so then I don't get home till like 9 o'clock or something like that. So then that's when I'm eating. And so when I eat animal protein that late, even like after I usually stop eating animal protein, I try to cut it off around 6 because my digestive system really likes catching up at night, and digesting food in the middle of the night has a lot of different effects on my body, especially in regards to my blood sugar. So I was starting to notice that my blood sugar was staying pretty high throughout the night, and especially when I wake up in the morning, it'd be pretty high. So I was kind of playing with my basal rate at night, but then ultimately, I knew, because I know my body, I knew it wasn't the best scenario for me. So I started thinking about, all right, I still want to have protein and enough protein to supplement all the breaking down of muscle tissue that I'm doing in the gym. And so I compromised, and I've started to have bone broth protein right after I get done working out. So basically, shortly before bed, because that's getting pretty late already. And it's made a huge difference. I'm able to stay really consistent, or my blood sugar stays really stable throughout the night. And even towards the morning, it starts to drop. So it tells me that my insulin sensitivity is getting better because of that. So that's been a win for me, to be able
Nice.
to navigate that a little bit better.
Nice. It's always because, if you go from not working out a lot or working out at some baseline level and you're increasing it as a type 1 diabetic, it's like, how is this going to change everything?
Mm-hmm.
You then throw life in there. You throw working 40, 50, 60 hours. You throw working in watching your kids and now, or, trying to work out while you're now working from home and now your kids are being homeschooled and whatever have you, to get those wins of figuring out, oh, maybe if I do this, and I know my body likes this, but figuring it out, psh, that's huge. That's
Mm-hmm.
literally what living free and living the life you deserve is all about. That's awesome, man.
Mm-hmm.
It's exciting.
Yeah. What about you? What's been a win for you?
So more on the frustrating side, well, it's a win, but the frustrating like insurance side of things. So I have, because of my how much I'm working and things like that, I haven't had a lot of free time to make a lot of calls I need to for my diabetes, i.e. calling my insurance, calling different third-party administrators or TPAs of different health products such as Dexcom or such as Medtronic or such as XYZ or whatever have you. And so, but all of a sudden, my Guardian for my Medtronic, my CGM, stopped working. It was literally like 3 days into me putting it in. And I got ticked. I was like, I just put the sensor in, and I just changed this last one after 2 days, and I already have to call them to say, give me more, blah, blah, blah. So I figured after troubleshooting that it was actually the Guardian self, the Link, like
Mm-hmm.
my Link 3. And so I was like, well, it has been a while since I've had it. I was thinking about the time frame. This is where the diabetic win comes in. Somebody on the other line just was a straight up baller. Was incredible. Literally, like from the scene of Mr. Incredible. So while I was on the phone with this person, they were able to navigate me in a way that I was truthful and honest. But I said the right things in the right way to get a new within warranty link without having to pay anything or use my insurance. Because
Nice.
essentially, I, like you've talked about, you've gotten your own insurance recently. I have new type of insurance, and I've just started the conversation of saying, okay, new insurance, like, what do you prefer? Do you prefer this type of pump? Do you prefer this pump? What kind of test strips? Like, I'm trying to figure out the most cost-effective way with my deductible and how to use my money and how to use my insurance in a way that it doesn't break my bank, but
Mm.
I able to manage the diabetes the way that I know how, that I like to do. So I'm still like in that way of figuring that out. So the last thing I wanted to do was have to go through my insurance, my new insurance, and go everything. And so this guy was essentially like from the scene in The Credibles. He was like, I would like to help you, but I can't. This is the scene from the first Incredibles when he's like super depressed, hasn't got like his old suit yet. Even he's like, I'd like to tell you to file Form C3B and talk to Roz, but I can't. And the old lady in Incredibles is like, what? And then like shoves the form like in her face, like Form C3B. I'd like to tell you. And and then later in the Credibles, he's like, I don't understand, Bob, how all your clients know all the loopholes of our system. He's like, who's protecting our shareholders, Bob? And this guy on the other phone was a straight up G, and he helped me figure out a way to stay within warranty, get a new one without utilizing my insurance. So that took so much stress, and it was like within 24 hours he sent it to me. He like
Nice.
overnight it, and then I got it super fast, and it was just like super awesome experience. It's like, I'd appreciate you giving me a review. I was like, I'll give you a million
Oh yeah,
reviews,
yeah.
like Mr. Incredible. I'll give you like a million reviews. So it was a diabetic win because it was somebody else helping me navigate a frustrating side of living with diabetes, which is the insurance side, which is the logistics side of figuring everything else out, making calls, things like that. And that just felt like a win because it made me feel like I wasn't alone, made me feel like somebody
Mhm.
understood, and as well as financially was a win, and all these other things. So I mean,
Yeah.
it was a real big help. And so shout out to that guy, and just shout out to anybody who gets it, understands. And you might be part of a system, you might be part of like a giant machine, but if you understand where people are coming from and able to just be honest still and make things work, not good on you. And shout out to those people, because that's really how I was, to this day, even though it's been weeks now. Well, I guess it's been 2 weeks, but anyways, that was my diabetic win recently, and I'm very happy about it. And even the more I talk about it now, the happier I get, because I just think about some guy I've never met somewhere else in the country totally helped me in a way that he didn't have to. He could have totally just been like, well, what's your insurance ID?
Yep.
So
Yeah. Yeah. It's nice to have somebody advocating for you. And like I said, it's even nicer that he was a complete stranger. It just makes you feel good. Like it feels good to do that for somebody, but it also feels good to have that done for you too.
hmm yeah, like, yeah, the fact that I was a stranger, like, I have friends that work in medical device departments, and I'm trying to get some hookups on some free samples of different things. And but that's like a buddy, right? That's a friend.
Mm-hmm.
And which is so, I do things for him, he does things for me, whatever. But this guy literally didn't have to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
So just little acts of kindness that people can do to one another, diabetic or not diabetic related. That's especially in a year where everyone's at each other's throats, tensions are high, people are scared, people are angry. you
Mm-hmm.
know Sharing good things, sharing good news is always helpful. So
Yep.
uh on the next couple episodes, we're actually gonna have some guests here,
Yeah.
Grady, and I'm super excited. It's been a while since we've had a guest. I'm really excited for the next two guests. One is somebody that I started contacting with in Japan, who is a type 1 diabetic, and but follows a carnivore diet, uses MDIs, and then is able to have pretty steady blood sugar with that method, which I think is super interesting, because both you and I don't only eat carnivore and definitely don't do MDIs, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a super interesting way of going about it. In fact, that you're just from a different country, like, it's gonna be super cool just talking to
Yeah.
somebody, from a different country.
Oh yeah.
The another guest is gonna be Dr. Stephan Hussey, and he's a med practitioner. He's a chiropractor. He's a type 1 diabetic himself, and very excited for the conversation we'll have with him. And he's a health coach, and just to get to know him for the first time and talk to him. So we got some good episodes lined up, some good content, and excited to share it more with people, whether it be on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, things like that. So stay tuned. And as always, we always appreciate people listening, especially since we rambled about an article that both you and I don't agree with per se. But yeah, we were able to find meaningful conversations and truths in them anyways. So cool. Well, again, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode of the Diabetes Podcast.
See ya.
You can end it.